$750,000. That's what they paid me to disappear. After my husband's secret wedding to his pregnant mistress, his mother slid that check across a Manhattan table like I was nothing more than a business expense. I signed it, took the money, and vanished to London within hours. My name is Claire Miller, and I thought my story was over. 3 months later, I'm opening mail in my tiny London flat when my world explodes. Hospital bill $847,000. Patient name redacted. Guarantor Miller Family Foundation. The same foundation where I'm still listed as co-trustee. My ex-husband's new wife needed expensive treatment for her high-risk pregnancy. With twins. And they'd used my legal authority without my permission to pay for it. I call Ethan with shaking hands. Claire, please, his voice cracks through the phone. If we don't cover this, Victoria could lose the babies. That's when I laugh. Not because it's funny, but because of what they don't know yet. See, while they were celebrating their twins, planning their perfect future, I was staring at my own pregnancy test. Positive. 6 weeks along. Here's what changes everything: they gave me co-trustee powers to make their foundation look legitimate. Now I'm pregnant with the next generation of Miller heirs. Every dollar they want to spend, every grant they want to approve, every transaction over $2 million needs my signature. My son will inherit his rightful share of everything they built. And until he's old enough to claim it, I control the keys to their empire. They paid me to disappear, but accidentally handed me the power to freeze their entire world with a single word number. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The radiator in Claire Miller's Princeton kitchen clicked its familiar evening rhythm. She ladled soup into 2 bowls, steam rising in lazy spirals toward the overhead light that hummed just slightly off-key. The sound used to comfort her. Tonight it felt like waiting. She arranged her pill organizer beside the stove. 7 days of small compartments, each one a quiet promise that tomorrow would come. The Medicare card lay nearby, though at 36 she carried it only for her mother's appointments. Still, she kept it close. Some habits felt safer than hope. Ethan's footsteps crossed the hardwood behind her. She didn't turn around, but she felt him pause by the mail pile on the granite counter. The pile looked thinner than usual. "Did you already bring the mail in?" she asked, stirring the soup once more. His eyes flicked away from hers when she finally turned. "What mail?" "The stack by the coffee maker. It's smaller." Ethan wiped his hands on the dish towel. Then wiped them again. His movements carried the careful precision of someone choosing what to touch. "I sorted through some of it earlier." Claire watched him slip something into his suit pocket. The motion was smooth, practiced. Like he'd done it before. What was in there? Nothing important. His voice came too quickly, the words stepping on each other. The kitchen fell quiet except for the radiator's metallic conversation with itself. Claire set down the ladle and studied her husband's face. Ethan had never been good at lying, but he'd gotten better at avoiding the truth. His phone buzzed against the granite. Once. Twice. Then silence as he flipped it face down without looking at the screen. "Who keeps calling this late?" Claire asked. She tried to sound casual, but her throat tightened around the words. "Work. At 9:30? Ethan pulled his tie loose, not meeting her eyes. "You know how it is with the foundation. International calls. Different time zones." Claire nodded because nodding felt safer than asking more questions. But her hands trembled slightly as she ladled soup into his bowl. The liquid splashed against porcelain, a small sound that seemed too loud. They ate in relative silence. Ethan's phone stayed face down, but Claire could see the glow when new messages arrived. Each time the light pulsed, his jaw tightened just slightly. She found herself counting the intervals. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, then another pulse. After dinner, she opened the refrigerator to put away leftovers. The ultrasound magnet caught her eye. She'd placed it there years ago, back when hope still felt like a plan rather than a punishment. The grainy image of what might have been stared back at her. She pressed the magnet flat with her palm, smoothing it against the white surface like she could smooth away the memory it held. The refrigerator hummed beneath her touch. Maybe the problem wasn't the phone calls, she thought. Maybe it was what he was trying not to say. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling. Claire made coffee while Ethan showered upstairs. Steam drifted from her mug as she stood by the kitchen window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The neighborhood looked muted, as if someone had turned down the color. She could hear water running through the pipes above her head. Ethan always took long showers when something bothered him. This morning, the water ran for 25 minutes. When he came downstairs, his hair was perfectly styled, his shirt crisp. He moved with the deliberate control of someone who had decided something in private. "I have an early meeting," he said, not quite looking at her. "What kind of meeting?" "Family business. Foundation stuff." Claire poured coffee into his travel mug. Black, no sugar. The way he'd always taken it. "Will your mother be there?" Ethan paused with his jacket halfway over his shoulders. "Probably. She called yesterday while you were out." "What did she want?" "She didn't say. Just asked when you'd be home." Ethan finished putting on his jacket. He kissed Claire's forehead, a brief touch that felt more like punctuation than affection. "I'll be home for dinner." After he left, Claire stood in the doorway and watched his car disappear around the corner. The house felt different when he wasn't in it. Quieter, but also more hollow, like sound had more space to echo. She spent the morning organizing medical files. Insurance forms, appointment reminders, prescription refill notices. Each paper represented another month of careful hope, another cycle of trying and waiting and trying again. The stack had grown thick over the years. At noon, she drove to the grocery store. The parking lot was half empty, and the automatic doors wheezed as she entered. She moved through familiar aisles, adding items to her cart without much thought. Milk, bread, the kind of soup Ethan liked. At the checkout, the cashier made polite conversation about the weather. Claire smiled and nodded, but her mind kept drifting to the folded paper Ethan had slipped into his pocket. The way his fingers had moved so carefully, like he was handling something fragile. That evening, they attended a family brunch at Marla's private club outside town. The building sat behind iron gates, its red brick softened by decades of careful maintenance. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished wood and fresh flowers. Marla Miller held court at a corner table, her silver hair styled in perfect waves. She wore pearls and the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than announced. When Claire approached, Marla's smile carried all the warmth of winter sunlight through glass. "Claire, dear, you look tired." "I'm fine, thank you." Marla's eyes moved over Claire's face like she was reading small print. "Are you? You seem strained." Claire took her seat across from Marla. Ethan chose the chair beside his mother, leaving Claire to face them both. The arrangement felt intentional. "We were just discussing legacy," Marla said, tapping her nails against the white tablecloth. Each tap was precise, measured. "The importance of continuing what we've built." Claire reached for her water glass. The crystal felt cold against her palm. "Of course. A family line doesn't continue on wishes," Marla continued. Her voice stayed pleasant, but something sharp lived beneath the words. "It requires substance." Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. She glanced at Ethan, hoping for some sign that he would redirect the conversation. He studied his menu as if it contained state secrets. "I understand," Claire said quietly. "Do you?" Marla leaned forward slightly. "Because understanding and accepting are different things, aren't they?" The waiter appeared, offering a reprieve. They ordered in careful politeness while the conversation shifted to safer ground. But Claire could feel Marla's attention like a weight, pressing against her composure. Halfway through the meal, Claire excused herself to the restroom. The ladies' lounge was all marble and soft lighting, designed to be flattering. But under the fluorescent lights above the mirror, Claire looked pale and drawn. She gripped the edge of the sink and studied her reflection. Her wedding ring felt loose on her finger. She tightened it, then loosened it again, twisting the band in small circles. "I'm fine," she whispered to her reflection. But the words didn't land with any conviction. When she returned to the table, Marla and Ethan were speaking in low voices. They stopped when they saw her approaching. "Everything all right?" Ethan asked. "Perfect," Claire said, settling back into her seat. The piano player in the corner began a soft melody. Something classical and melancholy that seemed to match the gray light filtering through tall windows. Claire found herself focusing on the music rather than the conversation around her. Claire? Marla's voice cut through her thoughts. I'm sorry, what? I asked if you understood what's at stake. Claire set down her fork carefully. I'm not sure what you mean. Marla's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. I think you do. The piano music continued, notes floating over the quiet tension at their table. Claire felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure that made her want to stand up and leave. But she stayed seated, hands folded in her lap, wedding ring catching the light. That night, Claire helped Ethan hang his jacket in the bedroom closet. As she lifted it from his shoulders, she heard paper crackle inside the pocket. The sound was soft but distinct, like autumn leaves underfoot. She didn't open the pocket. Instead, she held the jacket for a moment, feeling the hidden weight of whatever he was carrying. The paper felt substantial, important. Not a receipt or a business card. She hung the jacket carefully and turned away. But as she moved through their nighttime routine, the sound of that crackling paper followed her. It whispered of secrets and careful silences. As she lay in bed that night, listening to Ethan breathe beside her, Claire realized something had changed. The silence in their house had always been comfortable. Now it felt expensive, like something they were paying for but couldn't afford. She stared at the ceiling and understood, finally, that the quiet between them wasn't peace. It was a price someone had already named. The black car that picked up Claire outside Princeton smelled like leather and fresh citrus cleaner. The driver wore a dark suit and spoke only to confirm her destination: Miller Family Foundation headquarters in Manhattan. Through tinted windows, New Jersey suburbs gave way to city towers that pierced a gray November sky. The foundation's glass building rose 30 stories above the financial district. In the lobby, marble floors stretched like a frozen lake beneath chandeliers that cast cold light. Claire's heels clicked against the stone with each step, the sound echoing off walls lined with portraits of distinguished donors. A receptionist with perfect posture and careful makeup approached. She wore the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Mrs. Miller? They're waiting for you. They? Conference room 12, top floor. The elevator rose silently, numbers climbing past floors Claire had never seen. When the doors opened, she stepped into a hallway that smelled of expensive air freshener and old money. Everything was beige and gold, designed to intimidate through understatement. The receptionist led her past offices where people worked behind glass walls, their movements precise and quiet. No one looked up as they passed. The hallway felt like walking through a museum where she was both visitor and exhibit. Here, the receptionist said, gesturing toward tall double doors. Claire paused with her hand on the polished brass handle. Through the glass panel, she could see figures seated around a long table. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind them like a backdrop painted to suggest power. She pushed the door open. The conference room was larger than her living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Hudson River, where barges moved slowly between bridges. The table could seat 20, but only 4 chairs were occupied. Marla sat at the head of the table, her silver hair catching light from the windows. She wore a navy suit and her grandfather's watch, the one she claimed had timed 3 generations of important decisions. Her hands were folded, fingers interlaced with the patience of someone who owned time itself. Ethan sat across the table from where Claire was meant to sit. Not beside her, where a husband might offer support. The distance felt deliberate, like a statement about allegiance. A thin man in wire-rimmed glasses occupied the chair to Marla's right. He wore the careful neutrality of someone paid to handle difficult conversations. Papers were stacked precisely in front of him, edges aligned like building blocks. Claire, Marla said, her voice carrying the warmth of winter sunshine. Please, sit. Claire took the chair facing the windows. The leather was soft and expensive, designed to suggest comfort while offering none. Behind Marla's shoulder, she could see people moving through offices in adjacent buildings, their lives continuing in small, distant squares of light. Thank you for coming, the thin man said. I'm David Hoffman, the family's attorney. We thought it best to handle this matter directly. Handle what matter? Marla answered instead. A clean dissolution. No finger-pointing, no public mess. Just a clear path forward for everyone. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through Claire's comprehension. She looked at Ethan, hoping for clarification, for some sign this wasn't what it sounded like. Ethan studied his hands. His wedding ring caught the light as he turned it slowly around his finger. I don't understand, Claire said. David slid a folder across the table. The manila surface was unmarked, but something about its weight suggested importance. The situation has become complicated. Claire didn't touch the folder. What situation? Marla spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering news. Ethan's relationship with Victoria has produced consequences. The room went quiet except for the distant hum of traffic below and the soft whistle of wind against windows. Claire felt the air leave her lungs, but she kept her posture straight, her expression controlled. What kind of consequences? She's pregnant, Ethan said without looking up. With twins. The words hit like cold water. Claire's hands tightened on the leather armrests, her knuckles going white. She felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a door closing that couldn't be reopened. You're replacing me. We're solving a problem, Marla corrected. Before it becomes a crisis. David opened the folder to reveal papers covered in legal language. The text was dense, full of clauses and subclauses that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. But at the bottom of the last page, a number sat in bold type: $750,000. He placed a pen precisely where her signature would go. The pen was heavy, silver, with the foundation's logo engraved near the tip. Sign here, and you'll receive the amount specified. In return, you agree to leave quietly and never speak about family business. Claire stared at the number. $750,000. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. Her mind automatically calculated rent for years, medical bills paid, the crushing weight of trying and failing lifted from her shoulders. You're paying me to disappear. We're offering you a fresh start, Marla said. A chance to build something new without the burden of our expectations. Claire thought about her bank account. The careful budgeting, the postponed doctor visits, the years of hope measured in prescription costs and insurance deductibles. She thought about the humiliation of sitting in waiting rooms, filling out forms that asked about family history and future plans. Did you ever love me? She asked Ethan. He looked up then, his face carrying the weight of someone who had practiced this conversation. Claire, please. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that had already burned. Outside, the city continued its daily business, indifferent to the small human drama playing out 30 floors above the street. Claire picked up the pen. It was heavier than she expected, like an anchor in her hand. She read the signature line Claire Miller, printed in neat block letters beneath a blank space that waited for her handwriting. If I sign this, I stop existing. You start living, Marla said. On your own terms. Claire signed her name in careful script, each letter deliberate and final. The ink was blue-black, permanent. When she finished, she folded the check once, then twice, and slipped it into her purse like she was hiding evidence of a crime. She stood without speaking. Her legs felt unsteady, but she managed to walk to the door without stumbling. Behind her, she could hear papers being shuffled, the quiet efficiency of people cleaning up a concluded transaction. At the door, she turned back once. Ethan was watching her now, his expression unreadable. Marla had already moved on to other papers, other business. Goodbye, Claire said. No one answered. The elevator descended in silence, floor numbers counting down like a backwards countdown. When the doors opened in the lobby, Claire stepped out into marble and crystal light. The portraits of distinguished donors watched her pass with painted eyes that revealed nothing. Outside, the city air was cold and sharp. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching people move past with purpose and direction. Everyone seemed to know where they belonged. She pulled out her phone and called a cab. While she waited, she opened her purse and looked at the folded check one more time. The paper was expensive, the printing precise. Her name appeared in the corner pay to the order of Claire Miller. But standing there on the sidewalk, clutching a piece of paper worth more than her yearly salary, she felt like she was holding someone else's life. The cab arrived, and she gave the driver the airport address. As they pulled away from the curb, she watched the foundation building disappear behind other towers, becoming just another piece of the skyline. She didn't look back again. The airport terminal buzzed with the controlled chaos of people in motion. Overhead announcements echoed across polished floors where travelers pulled wheeled suitcases in straight lines toward their departures. Claire stood in the security line, passport in one hand, boarding pass in the other, watching strangers move through their own journeys. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marla, family courtesy lunch before your flight. Airport lounge, 2 p.m. Claire stared at the message. She wanted to delete it, to pretend she hadn't seen it. But underneath the request was an expectation that felt like gravity, pulling her toward compliance. She replied, "I'll be there." The lounge occupied a corner of the upper level, behind frosted glass doors marked "Premium Members Only." Inside, soft jazz played over conversations conducted in careful voices. Business travelers worked on laptops while flight attendants moved between tables carrying silver trays. Marla had claimed a table near the windows where departing planes taxied toward runways. She wore a cream-colored suit and held herself with the posture of someone who had never doubted her place in any room. When she saw Claire approaching, she gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit, dear. We have a few minutes before your flight." Claire sat, setting her purse carefully on the floor beside her chair. Through the window, a plane lifted off into gray sky, its wings catching late afternoon light. "I thought it would be best if you left before anyone asks questions," Marla said. She spoke in the tone she might use to discuss dinner plans, casual and matter-of-fact. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that arise when marriages end suddenly. People talk, especially in Princeton. It's better if you're simply elsewhere when that happens." A waiter appeared, dressed in the dark uniform that marked him as lounge staff. He smiled at Marla with the recognition of someone who knew her preferences. "The usual, Mrs. Miller? Sparkling water. 2 glasses." The waiter returned with crystal glasses and a small bottle that hissed when opened. Claire watched bubbles rise through clear liquid, tiny spheres seeking surface. "Where will you go?" Marla asked. "Europe. I have some money saved." "Yes, I imagine you do now." The comment hung in the air between them, neither question nor statement but something sharper than both. Claire sipped her water and said nothing. Movement near the lounge entrance caught her attention. A young woman had entered, moving with the careful grace of someone aware of her effect on rooms. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and features that photographers would call striking. Her hand rested on her belly in a gesture that seemed both protective and proud. "Victoria." She approached their table with confidence, not looking at Claire directly but somehow making her presence felt. When she reached them, she placed her other hand on the table, fingers spread to display a wedding ring that caught light from the windows. "Marla," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone whose place was secure. "I wanted to thank Claire personally." Claire felt her throat tighten. "Thank me? For being so mature about everything. I know this can't be easy." The word mature landed like a slap disguised as a compliment. Claire gripped her water glass tighter, feeling the condensation slip against her palm. "Of course," Claire managed. Victoria smiled, the expression carrying victory without cruelty. She was simply a woman who had won something valuable and wanted to acknowledge the previous owner graciously. "I'm sure you'll find happiness," Victoria continued. "Somewhere new, with a fresh start." Claire's phone buzzed against the table. A banking notification appeared on the screen, large deposit cleared. Available balance $752,143.67. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. The sound seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet lounge, drawing glances from nearby tables. Claire bent to retrieve it, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The waiter who had served them water approached with a practiced smile. "Allow me," he said, bending to pick up the phone. As he handed it back, his eyes caught the banking notification still displayed on the screen. His smile shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming the careful expression of someone who had just learned something they weren't supposed to know. When he straightened, he glanced between Claire and Marla with new understanding. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" he asked, his voice carrying a different quality now. "We're fine," Marla said sharply. The waiter nodded and moved away, but Claire could feel his attention like a weight, pressing against her composure. Marla slid another sheet of paper across the table. An addendum to the agreement they'd signed earlier, with a sticky note marking the signature line. Just routine, Marla said, her finger covering part of the text. Additional confidentiality provisions. Claire tried to read around Marla's hand, but the legal language was dense and technical. She could make out fragments, co-trustee authorization, and foundation governance, and successor beneficiary rights. What does this mean? Nothing you need to worry about. Just sign where the note indicates. Claire picked up the pen that Marla had placed beside the paper. It was the same heavy silver pen from the conference room, the foundation logo etched into its surface. The weight felt familiar now, like an anchor she was learning to carry. She signed without reading further. The sticky note left a faint residue on her finger when she peeled it away, a small reminder of how easily they had guided her hand. Victoria had moved to another table, where she sat with a man Claire didn't recognize. They were looking at papers spread between them, their conversation animated but quiet. Every few moments, Victoria would glance toward Claire's table, her expression unreadable. "Your flight boards in 30 minutes, Marla said, checking her watch. The timepiece was old and expensive, handed down through generations of women who had never doubted their place in the world. Claire stood, her chair legs scraping softly against polished floor. "I should go." "Yes," Marla agreed, "you should." Claire gathered her purse and boarding pass, moving with deliberate control. She refused to hurry, refused to let them see her break composure. As she walked toward the lounge exit, she kept her steps measured and her posture straight. At the door, she turned back once. Marla had already moved to Victoria's table, where papers were being signed and plans were being made. The future was being written in careful handwriting while the past packed its bags and headed for the gate. Claire walked through the terminal toward her departure, the sticky note residue still clinging to her finger. It was small and invisible, but it felt like proof of something she couldn't yet name. Behind her, the lounge continued its quiet business, full of people who belonged exactly where they were. The rental apartment sat on the third floor of a converted townhouse in London's Bloomsbury district. Rain tapped against windows that overlooked a narrow street where black cabs moved between puddles that reflected streetlight. The radiator coughed like an old lung, filling the small space with intermittent warmth. Claire set the divorce papers on the kitchen table beside a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The document was thick, bound with blue ribbon, and stamped with official seals that made everything feel permanent. Her signature appeared in multiple places, each one a small surrender to the inevitable. She opened her suitcase slowly, as if sudden movements might break the careful quiet she had built around herself. Inside, clothes were folded with the precision of someone who had packed her entire life into 2 pieces of luggage. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a framed photo of her wedding day. In the picture, she and Ethan stood beneath an arch of white roses. Her dress was simple, elegant. His smile reached his eyes. They looked like people who believed in forever. She set the photo face down on the bedside table. The apartment came furnished with things that belonged to no one: a couch covered in neutral fabric, a dining table that could seat 4 strangers, artwork that was pleasant and forgettable. Everything was clean and temporary, designed for people passing through. Claire's phone sat silent on the counter. For 3 days, it hadn't rung once. No calls from Princeton friends, no messages from family. The silence felt like exile and relief in equal measure. On the 4th day, the phone finally lit up with a number labeled, unknown. Claire watched it ring, the screen pulsing with each tone. She didn't answer. She just counted the rings: 8, 9, 10, then silence. A minute later, it rang again. Same number, same patient insistence. This time she let it go to voicemail. The message was brief: "Claire, it's Ethan. We need to talk. Please call me back." She deleted the voicemail without listening to it again. The mail forwarding service delivered letters in weekly bundles, each one stamped with addresses that felt like messages from a previous life. Bank statements, medical bills, subscription renewals for magazines she no longer wanted to read. Among the usual correspondence, one envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to her Princeton address but bore the logo of the Social Security Administration. Inside, a form requested identity verification and current address information. Claire read the letter twice, confusion growing with each paragraph. Why would the government be asking her to verify her identity? She had never applied for benefits, never reported any changes to her status. She folded the letter and shoved it into a kitchen drawer, alongside takeout menus and utility information she didn't understand. Some problems, she decided, could wait until she felt stronger. But the letter bothered her, lurking in the back of her mind like a question she couldn't answer. The grocery store on the corner became her refuge. She walked the narrow aisles slowly, reading labels she didn't need to read, choosing between options that didn't matter. The British accents around her created a comfortable distance from her own thoughts. One afternoon, standing in the produce section beneath harsh fluorescent lights, nausea hit her like a wave. The smell of fresh fruit and cleaning chemicals mixed in her throat. She gripped the edge of a display case, waiting for the feeling to pass. A woman with a small child asked if she was all right. Claire nodded, managed a smile, and moved toward the exit. But outside, the feeling persisted. She sat on a bench across from the store, pressing her palm to her stomach. Not now, she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was asking to wait. The clinic was a 20-minute walk through streets that grew quieter as she moved away from the commercial district. The building was Victorian brick with modern additions, designed to suggest both tradition and progress. In the waiting room, she filled out forms that asked about medical history and emergency contacts. The pen trembled slightly in her hand when she reached the line for relationship status. She wrote, single, and immediately wanted to cross it out. The doctor was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a Pakistani accent that made her voice sound musical. She spoke gently, but her words landed like thunder. You're pregnant. About 6 weeks, I'd estimate. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She laughed once, a sound that came out sharp and surprising. Then she covered her mouth with her hand, terrified of what that laugh might mean. Are you certain? The blood test is quite clear. Congratulations. Claire took the printed results with hands that shook slightly. The paper felt warm from the machine, the numbers and words still fresh with possibility she had stopped allowing herself to feel. I need to think, she said. Of course. We have counseling services if you'd like to discuss your options. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of approaching winter. Claire walked slowly back to her apartment, the test results folded carefully in her coat pocket. Her footsteps echoed off wet pavement, each one marking time between one life and whatever came next. In the apartment, she sank to the floor beside the door, still wearing her coat and shoes. The radiator coughed its familiar rhythm while she stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what had just changed. This was supposed to be impossible. Years of trying, of hoping, of measuring time in cycles and procedures and careful disappointment. Now, in a rented apartment on the other side of the ocean, her body had decided to remember what it was designed to do. She pressed both hands to her stomach, feeling only the slight softness that had always been there. No movement, no obvious signs. Just the medical certainty printed on paper and tucked into her pocket. This changes everything, she said aloud to the empty room. Her voice sounded different when she spoke to herself, more honest than the careful politeness she'd been maintaining with the world. In the quiet of her temporary home, she could admit what she hadn't allowed herself to think. She wanted this child. She wanted this chance. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen table where she'd left them, but they felt less final now. Less like an ending and more like a comma in a sentence she was still learning to write. The radiator sighed into silence, leaving only the sound of rain against glass and the distant hum of London evening traffic. Claire remained on the floor, coat still buttoned, contemplating the weight of hope she had thought she'd lost forever. Outside, the city continued its ancient business of sheltering people between one chapter of their lives and the next. Memory arrived without invitation, carrying the antiseptic smell of the Princeton fertility clinic waiting room. Claire closed her eyes and was 28 again, sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs with Ethan beside her. Their knees almost touching in the cramped space. The waiting room had been painted a color someone had probably called calming green, but which made everyone look slightly sick under fluorescent lighting. Ethan had worn his lucky tie, navy blue with small silver dots, the one he'd worn to every important meeting for 3 years. He'd reached for her hand when they called her name for blood work. His palm was warm and slightly damp, the way it always got when he was nervous. "Whatever happens, we're in this together," he'd whispered, and she had believed him completely. In that memory, hope had felt like a shared burden rather than a private punishment. They had joked to lighten the fear, made plans that assumed success, bought vitamins and books about pregnancy as if optimism could influence biology. "One day we'll tell our kid how brave you were," Ethan had said after her first injection. Watching her dispose of the needle in a small red container they kept hidden in the bathroom cabinet. Claire had smiled through the sting, clutching the small paper bag of medications like it contained promises rather than chemicals. The memory shifted, jumping forward to a foundation gala 2 years later. Crystal chandeliers and black tie donors, speeches about legacy and charitable giving. Marla had worn emerald earrings and moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through calm water. "Our charming addition," Marla had said, introducing Claire to a cluster of elderly board members. "Never, my daughter-in-law. Never, part of the family. Always, addition," as if Claire were furniture that complemented the existing decor. At that gala, Claire had watched Marla sign donor agreements while a compliance officer nodded respectfully beside her. The pen moved with practiced authority, each signature carrying the weight of institutional approval. Ethan had leaned close to Claire's ear. "My mom's intense, but it's just business. You understand." Claire had understood, or thought she had. Another memory surfaced: Marla pushing a pen into Claire's hand at a smaller gathering, some kind of audit meeting in the foundation's conference room. "Just sign for the clearance, dear. Routine governance requirements." Claire had signed without reading, trusting the rhythm of their world. Accepting that some decisions were made by people who understood systems she didn't need to comprehend. She had believed she was helping, participating in the careful machinery of family business. Now, sitting in her London apartment with pregnancy test results on the table beside her, Claire understood what she had actually been doing. She had been placing herself into position, creating authorization, becoming a signature that could be used when needed and dismissed when convenient. Her laptop sat open on the small dining table, connected to spotty Wi-Fi that came with the apartment. She pulled up an email account she rarely used and composed a message to a U.S. attorney she'd found through online research. The subject line was simple: foundation governance questions. She attached photos of documents she'd photographed with her phone before leaving Princeton. Papers she'd signed without fully reading, agreements she'd approved because approval had been expected. In one photo, she could see text that had meant nothing to her at the time: co-trustee authorized signatory Claire Miller. She zoomed in on those words, reading them again and again until their significance began to settle like sediment in still water. She wasn't just Ethan's wife in the eyes of the foundation. She was a legal entity, a person with specific authority that couldn't simply be cancelled by divorce. The attorney's reply arrived within hours, despite the time difference. One sentence that realigned her understanding of everything. If that designation stands as recorded, the foundation cannot legally execute major transfers without your written consent. Claire read the email 3 times before its meaning penetrated fully. She scrolled through the attachments. The lawyer had included foundation bylaws, governance requirements, fiduciary responsibility guidelines. Her name appeared in multiple places, always in the same context. Co-trustee, authorized signatory, required approval for transactions exceeding specified amounts. She wasn't just a wife they'd paid to disappear. She was a key holder in a lock they had built around themselves. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan: "We need to talk. Please." Claire stared at the message for a long moment, then forwarded it to her attorney without responding. Every communication now felt like evidence in a case she was only beginning to understand. She opened her laptop again and began researching foundation law, nonprofit governance. The rights and responsibilities of board members who had been appointed rather than elected. She took notes in a small notebook she'd bought at the corner shop, filling pages with definitions and legal precedents. The radiator coughed its familiar rhythm while rain continued its gentle argument with the windows. Claire worked through the afternoon and into evening, building understanding piece by piece like someone assembling a puzzle without the box cover. When she finally closed the laptop, her neck ached and her eyes burned from screen light. But for the first time since leaving Princeton, she felt something other than grief or confusion. She felt informed. The past hadn't returned to comfort her with better memories. It had returned to explain the present, to show her what she'd signed and why it mattered now. Tomorrow, she would call the attorney again. Tonight, she would sit with the weight of understanding and plan her next move. With the careful precision of someone who had finally learned to read the game being played around her. Outside, London settled into its ancient rhythm of rain and resilience, sheltering people who were learning to rebuild their lives from whatever pieces remained. The video conference software took 3 attempts to connect properly through the apartment's temperamental internet. When the screen finally stabilized, Claire found herself looking at 2 faces in separate windows: James Morrison, a family attorney from Philadelphia, and Sarah Chen, a trusts and estates specialist from Manhattan. Claire had arranged papers across her small dining table like evidence in a trial. Foundation bylaws, board minutes, the documents she'd signed without fully comprehending their scope. Beside them sat her prescription bottle and Medicare card from her mother's appointments, old habits that steadied her hands, and the pregnancy test results from the clinic. Crisp white paper that anchored her to the future. "I want everything documented," Claire said to the 2 lawyers watching her through their cameras. "Every authorization I have, every requirement. They can't meet without me." Morrison leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Based on what you've shown us, your position is stronger than you realize. Foundation law requires unanimous consent from all designated trustees for any transaction exceeding $2 million. They can't just remove me? Not without cause, and not without legal process that would require disclosure," Chen added. "Corporate governance exists specifically to prevent this kind of arbitrary decision-making." Claire made notes in careful handwriting while they explained her rights and responsibilities. She had been appointed as co-trustee during the marriage as part of standard family foundation structure, designed to demonstrate broad governance and satisfy IRS requirements for charitable organizations. What Marla and Ethan had intended as window dressing had become structural necessity. "I want to call their bank," Claire said. "Confirm who has authority on the operating accounts." Morrison nodded. "That's well within your rights as co-trustee." The call to Citizens Trust took 15 minutes of transfers between departments before Claire reached someone who could answer her question. She used her calmest voice, the tone she'd perfected for dealing with insurance companies and medical billing departments. "I'm calling to verify authorized signatories on the Miller Family Foundation primary operating account." The banker's response was precise. "I show 2 authorized parties, Marla Miller and Claire Miller, both required for transactions exceeding specified limits." Claire thanked him and disconnected. For a moment, she simply sat in the quiet apartment, listening to rain against windows and the distant sound of London traffic. The weight of confirmation settled around her like armor she was learning to wear. She spent the afternoon requesting documents: complete foundation bylaws, board meeting minutes from the past year, financial statements, annual filings with regulatory agencies. Each request was formal, submitted through proper channels, documented and dated. Her printer ran out of ink twice. She walked to the corner shop for replacements, then returned to continue building her case file. Each page represented authority they had given her and now couldn't take away without legal process they couldn't afford to begin. The attorney had warned her about potential retaliation, accusations of mental instability, guardianship proceedings, public relations campaigns designed to discredit her credibility. Claire nodded as she listened, but the threats felt distant compared to what she had already survived. "Let them try," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. By evening, Claire had drafted a formal notice to the foundation board. The language was precise, legal, free of emotion. "Effective immediately, I will not approve any major foundation transactions until appropriate legal protections have been established for myself and my unborn child, and until all governance procedures have been reviewed for compliance with applicable law." She didn't threaten. She didn't demand. She simply stated her position with the authority of someone who had learned to read the rules others had written around her. Before sending the notice, she paused with her finger over the mouse button. She could imagine Marla's face when she read these words, the sharp intake of breath, the rapid calculation of consequences. For years, Marla had moved through the world assuming her authority was absolute. Tomorrow, she would learn that authority had limits. Claire clicked. Send, with a single, steady motion. Her phone buzzed almost immediately with Ethan's number. She let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call from a number she didn't recognize. Voicemail again. By 10 o'clock, she had 12 missed calls and 17 unread text messages. She turned off her phone and made tea, moving through her small kitchen with deliberate calm. Outside, London continued its business of sheltering people who were learning to stand up for themselves after years of sitting quietly in assigned seats. The radiator coughed its familiar rhythm. Rain tapped gently against windows. In the morning, Claire would check her messages and begin the careful work of negotiation from a position of unexpected strength. Tonight, she would sleep with the knowledge that silence could be its own kind of power when deployed with precision and protected by law. For the first time in months, the quiet felt like something she owned rather than something that owned her. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in Manhattan. The kind of gray December day when office lights stayed on all day and shadows never quite formed outside the windows. The Miller Family Foundation's conference room felt different under pressure, smaller, with less air, as if the crisis had changed the room's fundamental dimensions. Marla sat at her usual position at the head of the table, but her posture lacked its typical authority. Her hands moved restlessly over papers she'd already read multiple times, and her silver pen clicked rhythmically against legal documents that offered no clear solutions. David Hoffman, the family attorney, occupied his chair, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news to people who weren't accustomed to hearing it. Water glasses sat untouched while folders of bylaws and regulations grew thick with sticky notes marking relevant passages. Without Claire's authorization, Hoffman explained, his voice steady, but weighted with implications, you risk compliance violations that could trigger IRS review and potential loss of tax-exempt status. Board member Harrison Clark slammed his folder closed, the sound echoing off glass walls. We can't even approve routine grants? Not the ones tied to restricted funds and major transfers, Hoffman replied, pointing to highlighted text in the Foundation's governing documents. The designation requires unanimous trustee approval for any transaction exceeding $2 million. This is ridiculous, Clark continued, his face reddening above his navy tie. She signed the divorce agreement. She took the money. She left. Her marital status doesn't affect her role as co-trustee, Hoffman said patiently. Corporate governance and personal relationship are separate legal constructs. Marla's phone had been buzzing with increasing frequency throughout the morning. Reporters from Nonprofit Quarterly and Foundation Review had somehow learned about governance disputes at the Miller Foundation. Donors were calling to request clarification about pending grants that couldn't be approved. The development director had sent 3 urgent emails about major gift commitments that were now in limbo. How did this become public? Marla asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Hoffman consulted his notes. Someone filed an anonymous tip with the New Jersey Attorney General's office regarding potential coercion in nonprofit governance and irregular board actions affecting charitable beneficiaries. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one could locate. Around the table, board members exchanged glances that contained years of unspoken understanding about how family foundations were supposed to operate quietly, efficiently, without external oversight or public scrutiny. Elizabeth Stone, the newest board member and only one not related to the Miller family by blood or marriage, cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps we should consider reaching out to Claire directly. Find out what she wants. What she wants, Marla said sharply, is to punish us for moving forward. What she wants, Hoffman corrected, is legal protection for her rights as co-trustee and consideration of her unborn child's potential inheritance claims. The phrase, unborn child, landed like a physical blow. Marla's face went pale, then flushed. She had built her understanding of this situation around Claire as a problem to be solved. Not as a pregnant woman with legal standing that extended beyond her marriage to Ethan. Harrison Clark leaned forward. She's doing this for revenge. She's doing this for legal protection, Hoffman replied. Which, given the circumstances of her divorce, seems prudent. Ethan had tried calling Claire 17 times since receiving her formal notice. Each call went to voicemail. His text messages remained unread, marked only with delivery. Confirmations that proved she was receiving his attempts at communication and choosing not to respond. At 10:30, Hoffman's assistant knocked on the conference room door and announced that Claire's attorney was requesting a video conference to discuss resolution. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic and the barely audible whistle of wind against tall windows. James Morrison appeared on the wall-mounted screen, speaking from his Philadelphia office. With the calm precision of someone who held better cards than anyone at the table had anticipated. "My client is prepared to cooperate with all lawful foundation business," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the conference room speakers. "When her rights are properly documented and her position as co-trustee is acknowledged according to the governance structure your own attorneys established." Marla leaned toward the microphone. "She's using her pregnancy to manipulate us. She's using her legal authority to protect herself and her child," Morrison replied. "Authority that your foundation granted her and cannot now revoke without cause and due process." The video conference lasted 23 minutes. When it ended, the room remained quiet while board members processed the reality of their situation. The foundation they had controlled absolutely for 3 generations was now subject to approval from someone they had tried to pay to disappear. Elizabeth Stone broke the silence. "What exactly are our options?" Hoffman opened another folder. "We can contest her trustee status through legal proceedings that would require full disclosure of all board actions leading to her departure. We can attempt to restructure the foundation entirely, which would trigger regulatory review and potential tax implications. Or we can negotiate a resolution that acknowledges her authority while establishing clear boundaries for future governance." The list of options felt like a menu of unpalatable choices. Each path required admitting they had handled the situation badly, that their attempt to solve a family problem quietly had created a legal crisis with potential public consequences. Marla's phone buzzed again. Another reporter, another donor, another complicated conversation about foundation governance and family disputes that were supposed to remain private. At noon, the meeting adjourned without resolution. Board members gathered their papers and left through separate exits, each carrying folders full of legal documents that offered no easy answers. Marla remained in the conference room after everyone else had gone, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, where other people were conducting business that didn't require navigating between family loyalty and legal compliance. Her phone rang one more time. This time, she answered. "Marla Miller. This is Claire." The voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the defeat Marla had expected to hear from someone living in exile. Instead, Claire sounded like a person who had found her footing after stumbling and was ready to negotiate from solid ground. "I think we need to talk," Claire continued. "Not through attorneys, not through threats, just talk." Marla closed her eyes and tried to calculate the cost of pride versus the price of prolonged legal uncertainty. Outside, the December sky pressed gray light against conference room windows, where portraits of 3 generations of Miller family leadership watched over a legacy that was no longer entirely under their control. "Yes," Marla said finally. "I think we do." 6 months later, Claire pushed through the glass doors of the Princeton Community Legal Aid Office, carrying a thermal coffee cup and a leather satchel that had belonged to her mother. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, mixing with the sound of photocopiers and quiet conversations conducted in Spanish, English, and languages she couldn't identify. The waiting area held mismatched chairs arranged around low tables covered with pamphlets, "Understanding Your Medicare Benefits, Avoiding Financial Scams. Know Your Rights in Nursing Home Contracts." Elderly clients sat with manila folders and expressions of careful hope. The look of people who had learned not to expect too much from systems they didn't fully understand. Claire had been volunteering here twice a week since returning from London, helping clients organize insurance paperwork, Social Security correspondence, and the endless documentation required to prove entitlement to benefits they had earned through decades of work. She kept her own files in a blue binder labeled simply, "My name." "Mrs. Rodriguez is here about her Medicare supplement," Jenny, the intake coordinator, said as Claire settled at the small desk they'd assigned to her. "Something about claims they're saying aren't covered." Claire nodded and called Mrs. Rodriguez from the waiting area. The woman was 73, carefully dressed despite the early morning hour, carrying a shopping bag full of papers. She'd been collecting for months without knowing how to organize them. They spread the documents across the desk: EOBs, insurance statements, bills from specialists, letters from Medicare that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Claire read each paper carefully, sorting them into piles that began to tell a coherent story. "They keep saying, not medically necessary, Mrs. Rodriguez explained, her accent making the bureaucratic language sound even more foreign than usual. "But my doctor says I need this treatment." Claire found the relevant forms and helped Mrs. Rodriguez understand the appeals process. Together, they drafted a letter requesting review, including documentation that supported the medical necessity of her treatment. The work was methodical, requiring patience rather than expertise. "You don't have to accept their first answer," Claire explained, sealing the envelope. "Sometimes you just have to ask them to look again." At lunch, Claire walked through downtown Princeton, past boutiques and restaurants where she'd once felt comfortable, but now seemed to belong to someone else's life. Her pregnancy was beginning to show, a gentle curve that made strangers smile at her on the street. She stopped at the small park where she used to meet Ethan for quick lunches when their schedules allowed. The bench was still there, under oak trees that were beginning to show new spring growth. She sat down and pulled out her phone to check messages. 3 missed calls from her attorney, 2 from the foundation's new administrator, 1 from a number she didn't recognize. The business of entangling her life from the Miller family continued with steady progress and occasional complications. The foundation had eventually agreed to court-supervised mediation rather than risk public hearings about governance failures and family disputes. The proceedings had been formal, careful, with every agreement documented and filed with appropriate agencies. The final settlement acknowledged Claire's authority as co-trustee, while establishing clear procedures for foundation governance that couldn't be circumvented by personal relationships or family pressure. Her signature remained legally required for major transactions, but the foundation could conduct routine business without her involvement. More importantly, the agreement established a trust fund for her unborn child, with inheritance rights that couldn't be dissolved by marriage, divorce, or family disapproval. The child would have financial security regardless of what happened between Claire and the Miller family in future years. Ethan had issued a public statement that read like accountability but sounded like carefully crafted public relations. He acknowledged procedural errors in foundation governance and personal failures in communication, without admitting to coercion or deception. The statement satisfied legal requirements while preserving what remained of his public reputation. Marla's influence had been more significantly damaged. Board members who had once deferred to her authority now asked pointed questions about transparency and legal compliance. The foundation's annual meeting, once a formal ceremony celebrating charitable giving, had become a working session, focused on governance reform and regulatory compliance. Claire's phone rang. Marla's number appeared on the screen. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, Marla." "Claire." The voice was tight, controlled, carrying none of its former assumption of automatic respect. "I wanted to discuss the quarterly board meeting." "What about it?" "Your attendance is required for the approval of new grant commitments. The meeting is next Tuesday." Claire had known this call would come. The foundation couldn't approve major grants without her signature, and spring was the traditional time for announcing annual giving commitments. "I'll attend by video conference. The board would prefer your physical presence." "The board will accept whatever participation I choose to provide," Claire replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had learned to set boundaries and enforce them. There was a pause during which Claire could hear Marla calculating responses and discarding them as insufficient. "What do you want from us, Claire?" The question hung in the air between them, crossing the distance from Princeton to London and back again, carrying weight that neither woman had anticipated when this conversation began. "I want what I've always wanted," Claire said. "Respect, honesty, and legal protection for my child. You have that now. I have it in writing now." Which is not the same thing. Another pause, longer this time. When Marla spoke again, her voice carried something that might have been fatigue, or might have been the recognition that some battles couldn't be won through superior resources alone. "The foundation benefits from your participation. Your perspective adds value. It was the closest thing to an apology Claire was likely to receive, wrapped in language that allowed Marla to maintain dignity while acknowledging changed circumstances. "I'll attend the meeting," Claire said. "On video conference. And I'll review the grant proposals beforehand." After ending the call, Claire remained on the park bench, watching people move through their afternoon routines. Students from the university, retirees walking dogs, young parents pushing strollers along paths that wound between old trees and careful landscaping. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jenny at the legal aid office. "Mrs. Rodriguez heard from Medicare. They approved her appeal. She wants to thank you." Claire smiled, typing back, "Tell her she did the hard work. I just helped her organize it." The walk back to the office took her past the street where she and Ethan had lived together. She didn't turn down that road, but she didn't feel the need to avoid it either. It was simply part of the geography of her previous life, neither painful nor particularly important anymore. At the office, Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting with a small potted plant and tears of gratitude. "They said yes," she whispered, pressing the plant into Claire's hands. "After all these months, they said yes." Claire accepted the plant and the thanks, understanding that sometimes justice came in small victories rather than dramatic reversals. Mrs. Rodriguez would receive the medical care she needed. Her doctor's recommendations would be honored. The system had been made to work correctly for one person on one afternoon. That evening, Claire sat in her new apartment, smaller and quieter than the Princeton house but entirely her own. She prepared dinner while reviewing foundation documents for next week's board meeting, her laptop open on the kitchen counter beside the potted plant Mrs. Rodriguez had given her. The grant proposals were substantial funding for senior nutrition programs, legal aid services, community health clinics that served populations without other options. She read each application carefully, taking notes about programs that aligned with the foundation's mission and resources. Her unborn child moved gently, a subtle reminder of the future being written with each decision she made. Claire placed her hand on her belly and spoke quietly to the presence growing there. "We're going to be fine," she said, more promise than prediction. "We're going to make sure the money goes to people who need it." Outside, Princeton settled into its evening rhythm of tree-lined streets and porch lights. Sheltering people who were learning that sometimes the most important battles were fought with paperwork and patience rather than dramatic confrontations. Claire signed her name at the bottom of her review notes, each letter deliberate and clear. For the first time in years, her signature felt like it belonged completely to her. The radiator in her apartment hummed quietly, reliable and warm. Rain began to tap against windows that looked out on a street where she knew her neighbors' names and felt safe walking alone after dark. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to her attorney, confirming her attendance at Tuesday's board meeting and her preliminary approval of 3 grant proposals that would fund legal aid services for elderly clients who couldn't afford private attorneys. As she typed, Claire thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and the appeal letter they'd written together, about systems that could be made to work correctly. When someone understood how to navigate them, about the difference between charity and justice. Life didn't end just because it broke once. What fell apart could become the foundation for something stronger, built with better understanding of load-bearing walls and proper reinforcement. Her signature appeared at the bottom of the email, followed by her title co-trustee, Miller Family Foundation. The words looked strange but felt accurate, describing someone who had learned to use power thoughtfully rather than simply possess it quietly. If this story gave even a moment of strength to someone out there, then everything she'd survived meant something today. The late nights organizing legal documents, the careful navigation of family pressure and institutional inertia. The discovery that silence could be its own form of resistance when deployed strategically. If this resonated with you, she thought as she sent the email, maybe you'll find your own way to speak up when speaking up matters. Maybe you'll organize your own papers and learn your own rights and refuse to accept answers that don't serve justice. Your story might become the seed of the next chapter someone else needs to read. "Thank you for spending this time with me," she typed in a final message to her attorney. "Let's make sure Tuesday's meeting serves the people who need these programs most." Outside, the rain continued its gentle argument with spring evening air, washing the streets clean for whatever came next.